this video, we're delving into the chilling story of a Tennessee farmer forced to take justice into his own hands after a devastating personal tragedy. This father, once determined to remain neutral, became legendary for his custom .50 caliber rifle and relentless pursuit of vengeance. We'll explore how he used the winding Tennessee rivers as his hunting grounds, striking fear into the ranks of Union troops. His name rarely appears in standard history books, but the echoes of his actions continue to fascinate researchers today. Get ready for an intense look at the darker side of wartime survival, where lines between soldier, civilian, and outlaw blur in startling ways. Number 7. Untold shadows. As the Civil War ended and Reconstruction began, official attention shifted away from local vigilantes. Massive battles and political maneuvers overshadowed the smaller dramas of men like Henson. Yet the scars remained in each ravaged community. One might expect Henson to appear in post-war records as a wanted outlaw, but the chaotic nature of the era allowed many participants in guerrilla activities to slip back into obscurity. Some outlaws in the Western Territories also capitalized on the confusion following the war's end, moving to new areas and adopting new identities. Family lore suggests Henson quietly resettled, possibly reopening a mill or store. However, local whispers insisted he never traveled unarmed. People who recognized him avoided direct confrontation. Similar patterns played out among former Confederates across the South, many of whom maintained private grudges long after Lee surrendered. By the time the nation fixated on the legendary outlaws of the late 19th century, figures like the Dalton Gang, Butch Cassidy, and the Younger Brothers, Henson's story had receded into local legend. Yet the essential themes remained the same: personal loss, distrust of an occupying power, and a willingness to dispense lethal force outside the bounds of official law. Contemporary historians rediscovering Henson's name find that he fits squarely into the outlaw mold in certain respects, despite never robbing trains or staging bold holdups. Instead, he engaged in a personal war driven by a father's anguish. This narrative resonates with the violent sagas of the Old West, where one tragic incident could set a person on a bloody trail from which they could not return. His fate reflects a broader reality. War zones can breed outlaws who, under different circumstances, might have remained inconspicuous citizens. The Old West wasn't just about shootouts under a blazing sun. It was also any place where justice collapsed, and a man felt compelled to carve out his own. Today, references to Henson evoke discussions about moral complexity in warfare and how easily the label outlaw can apply once official institutions fail. This overlap of Civil War tragedy with frontier-style vengeance continues to intrigue scholars, challenging them to reassess tidy distinctions between soldier and renegade, or between a grieving father and a cold-blooded killer. Number 6. Aftermath of vengeance. Spiraling violence gripped the region as Union officials doubled down, arresting anyone suspected of assisting Henson. Houses were burned, livestock seized, and men imprisoned. In many ways, these policies echoed the heavy-handed tactics employed by frontier lawmen, determined to flush out famous bandits. Yet each crackdown often yielded minimal results. Henson was too elusive, aided by sympathetic contacts who shared his hatred for the occupying forces. This dynamic resembled how certain old Western outlaws like Jesse James found protection within local populations that distrusted the government. Within that messy environment, the moral lines blurred further. Some argue that Henson was needlessly prolonging bloodshed by targeting Union soldiers just doing their duty. Others retorted that his vendetta was justified given the horrifying nature of what had been done to his sons. Similar debates consumed frontier towns when outlaws claimed to be striking back at corrupt institutions. Often the real victims were everyday people trapped in the crossfire. Henson had left behind not just farmland, but also any semblance of ordinary life. Family members who remained in the area found themselves ostracized. Union forces sometimes destroyed or confiscated property they believed might belong to him, punishing those suspected of hiding details about his whereabouts. Personal accounts from the time reference how deep the fear of retribution ran. If someone collaborated with the army, they risked encountering Henson's rage. If they aided Henson, they risked Union retaliation. It was a bleak environment where survival trumped loyalty. This climate was reminiscent of isolated Old West towns paralyzed by bandit raids, forced to choose between cooperating with criminals or facing their wrath. The difference here was that a nationwide war magnified everything. Meanwhile, Henson's lethal accuracy grew legendary, with rumors that he amassed over 100 confirmed kills. Even if such numbers were inflated, it's clear he operated with frightening success. Number 5. Old West influences. The Old West conjures images of stagecoach robberies, standoffs at high noon, and frontier towns policed by stern-faced lawmen. Tennessee during the Civil War might seem distant from that visual, but the era's spirit of self-reliance and brutal reprisal was alive and well. Local settlers knew that law enforcement was stretched thin, with the bulk of Union and Confederate forces either engaged in bigger battles or preoccupied with protecting key supply lines. Similar to how outlaws and cowboys traversed vast prairies, Henson exploited the thick woodlands and winding rivers in his region to move undetected. He also tapped into the unwritten codes that governed frontiersmen. If your kin were slaughtered, you took matters into your own hands. This code predated the war and ran parallel to the ethics of many Native American groups, who had their own ways of retaliating for injustices committed against their communities. The concept of vigilante justice was not restricted to southwestern deserts or mountainous gold mining towns. It thrived anywhere official authority failed to protect people's basic rights. The best Old West history documentaries frequently point out that vigilantism and extrajudicial killings were almost expected in communities lacking a reliable court system or immediate police presence. In Henson's case, a formal plea for justice was useless because of the same troops who had carried out the violence now occupied his district. YouTube channels devoted to American Old West facts often highlight how complicated it is to label someone a hero or a criminal under these circumstances. The same ambiguity clings to Henson. Confederate partisans lauded him for his bravery, while Union forces dismissed him as a remorseless bushwhacker. Neutral civilians torn between fear and sympathy provided him with information and hiding spots. So he occupied this strange space between a local avenger, a cunning lone wolf, and a figure who evoked the iconic outlaws of the West. Number 4. Weapon of choice. In a time when muzzleloaders dominated warfare, obtaining a specialized .50 caliber rifle gave Henson a lethal edge. This type of weapon allowed for accurate long-range shots that standard infantry muskets found difficult to match. The gunsmith who built it utilized premium materials, ensuring that Henson had both improved range and greater stopping power. In an era lacking high-tech scopes, Henson's rifle likely had custom sights that gave him a significant advantage. Stories claim the stock eventually bore carved marks, each tally standing for a successful shot. Though reminiscent of outlaw lore, this practice also appears in certain frontier diaries where men kept a grim count of the kills they racked up over land disputes, livestock theft, or personal vengeance. The rifle became a symbol of fear. Union soldiers passing through the region spoke of a phantom sniper who could strike from distances they considered impossible. This sense of dread grew each time a high-ranking officer was found dead on a patrol boat or perched behind Union lines. Much like the unpredictability associated with Old West outlaws hiding in the rocky hillsides or the Badlands, Henson's cunning approach made him nearly impossible to catch. He had scouted vantage points in local hills and knew exactly where to hide along riverbanks. Soldiers complained that he wasn't fighting fair, as if fairness held any meaning in a war that had already stained the land with countless tragedies. Although some labeled him a traitor or a cold-blooded assassin, others viewed him as a man forced into a corner who had no other recourse. In that regard, he resembled many renegades in the Old West. More than just criminals, they were products of unjust circumstances, forging their own dangerous solutions. Number 3. A single act of horror. Neutrality in a war zone works until a single barbaric event pushes someone beyond all restraint. For Jack Henson, that event happened when Union soldiers executed 2 of his sons, under the claim that they were part of local guerrilla raids. Their ages, the lack of trial, and the subsequent mutilation of their bodies showed a level of cruelty that would have shaken even hardened frontier outlaws. Neighbors whispered about how savage the killings appeared, and the account spread quickly, further inflaming local resentment. The family's world collapsed in that moment. Unlike the quick-draw duels often romanticized in Old West tales, this was a cold exercise of power with no face-off or mutual chance to fire back. The savage nature of the assault on innocent teenagers signaled that war had no boundaries. That is precisely when Henson decided that if the Union Army could use terror to maintain its grip, he would respond in kind. Outlaw legends abound with stories of people turning to crime after a traumatic incident. They lose faith in official justice, forging their own path. Billy the Kid, for example, supposedly harbored deep grudges against those who had wronged him early in life. Though Henson's environment differed from the ranches of New Mexico or the saloons of Dodge City, the impetus for vengeance felt just as raw. Fueled by bitterness and the horror inflicted on his own family, he took up a custom rifle as his main tool for reprisal. Some accounts emphasize that while local Confederate sympathizers championed his actions, he was not motivated by ideology so much as raw, personal fury. This key distinction sets him apart from classic Confederate sharpshooters. Moreover, his decision to go outside regular military structures, operating like a clandestine killer, paralleled how Western outlaws functioned, evading lawmen by relying on knowledge of the land. Number 2. Seeds of conflict. Before the war began, Tennessee balanced uneasily between Unionist sentiment and Confederate loyalty. Landowners either aligned with the Southern cause or tried to remain neutral, fearing the effects of a national split on local industries like cotton and tobacco. Slaveholding families near the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers might not have seen themselves as future outlaws, but they understood that if war erupted, their lands would fall directly on strategic routes. The rivers served as prime channels for moving supplies, which drew federal attention early on. When Union forces occupied the region, local residents had to weigh the danger of aligning with the Confederacy against the peril of remaining neutral. That danger intensified with the arrival of Union patrols, who accused civilians of harboring guerrillas or passing information to rebel fighters. This environment had echoes of the Wild West, where mere suspicion could lead to deadly confrontations between traveling lawmen and suspected criminals. In Henson's case, his prime concern was tending to his property and safeguarding his family. Though he owned enslaved individuals, some historians suggest that his primary identity wasn't bound up in Confederate politics, but in preserving the quiet stability he had built. The region's thick forests and rolling farmland may not remind us of dusty cowboy plains, but it still possessed a dangerous allure for those wanting to ambush or raid. Unpredictable events such as scouting missions, forced recruitment drives, and battles over local forts left people in a constant state of anxiety. It didn't take much provocation for men to act out of sheer desperation. Over time, minor skirmishes turned personal, with families accusing soldiers of theft, trespassing, or worse. The seeds of conflict sprouted into a cycle of retaliation, reminiscent of frontier feuds in the Old West, except it was fueled here by the broader Civil War context. Henson's first steps toward infamy came when Union forces clamped down hard on guerrilla activity, offering little distinction between actual bushwhackers and civilians minding their own business. Number 1. Surprising ties. Many people associate Civil War sharpshooters with uniformed soldiers on traditional battlefields, yet evidence indicates that one of the deadliest among them was effectively an Old West outlaw by the time the war ended. This revelation shocks those who assume the Wild West and the Civil War were separate chapters in American history. In reality, the two eras overlapped, and the lawlessness we commonly link to cowboys and outlaws also existed in regions ravaged by the war. Jack Henson, the figure at the center of this narrative, began as a plantation owner in Tennessee, neither seeking a fight nor embracing grand political visions. Despite living east of the territories we label the Old West, his experiences and ultimate actions mirrored the brutal survival tactics of the frontier. His transformation unfolded when Union troops targeted his family, sparking a quest for retribution that elevated him to a near-mythical status, much like famous outlaws who faced relentless manhunts. While official armies clashed in epic confrontations at places such as Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg, Individuals like Henson waged their own private wars, leaving behind a legacy of whispered stories that merged Civil War events with the grit and desperation characteristic of the untamed West. The line between soldier and criminal, between vigilante and freedom fighter, often blurred in these chaotic pockets of conflict. Local power struggles, fear of guerrilla raids, and the fundamental drive for self-preservation inspired men to adopt drastic measures. Old Western outlaws, lawmen who turned to extrajudicial methods, and renegade Confederate partisans all highlight how easily an ordinary person could become an outlaw under extreme pressures. Studying Henson's story reveals a hidden side of the war that seldom appears in official records. Typically, historians focus on generals, battle strategies, and large-scale troop maneuvers. However, from the vantage point of someone like Henson, the war was a personal arena shaped by heartbreak and an urgent need for payback. He exemplifies how the Old West spirit of frontier justice, direct, sometimes merciless, could emerge in communities far from the deserts, canyons, or cattle ranches we usually picture.